March 31st, 1914, 4:40 in the afternoon. Somewhere on the open ice of the North Atlantic, roughly 23 miles northeast of Cape St. Francis, Newfoundland, the SS Stefano cuts through gray water at full steam. On the bridge, Captain Abraham Kean raises his field glass. Ahead, on the floe, shapes. Men. Dozens of them. Some are motionless. Some are pressed flat against the ice. The temperature is somewhere around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They have been out there for 36 hours. Kean lowers the glass. The Stefano does not slow. If you are watching from somewhere cold right now, tell me your country below. This expedition went dark at temperatures most of us have never experienced.
What no inquiry ever answered, not cleanly, not on record, is exactly what Abraham Kean saw through that glass, and what he chose to do with it.
Welcome to the last expedition. What you just watched happened on a documented afternoon in March of 1914. 2 ships, 78 men on the ice between them. Both captains knew where those men were. Neither acted in time. Tonight we reconstruct the 1914 Newfoundland sealing disaster, one of the deadliest decisions in the history of polar expeditions, and the inquiry that stopped just short of calling it what it may have been. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications. New expeditions, every week. Let's begin. To understand what happened on that ice, you have to understand what the spring seal hunt was. Not the romance of it, the mechanics. Every March, the outport communities of Newfoundland, places like Bonavista, Twillingate, Greenspond, sent their men north. Not soldiers, not explorers, sealers. Fishermen's sons who had grown up reading ice the way other men read weather. They shipped out on steam-driven wooden vessels into the whelping ice of the North Atlantic, chasing the annual migration of harp seals across the floes. The harvest window was narrow. The competition between vessels was fierce, and the money, what little there was, flowed almost entirely to the ship owners. The men aboard the SS Newfoundland in March of 1914 were paid by the pelt. No pelts meant no wages. That arithmetic shaped every decision made on those ships, from the captain's bridge to the ice below. The Newfoundland was a wooden-hulled sealing steamer, registered out of St. John's. She had sailed the spring hunt for years. In 1914, she carried a complement of 132 sealers, most of them from the northeast coast of the island. Their average age was somewhere in the mid-20s. A number of them were teenagers. Some had never done the spring hunt before. They had boarded at St. John's in early March, their gear limited to the tools of their trade, gaffs, tow ropes, oilskins, and whatever personal clothing they had brought from home. There were no tents aboard, no emergency survival kits, no signal flares issued as standard equipment.
The Newfoundland's manifest for the 1914 voyage records no wireless radio equipment. She was, by the spring of 1914, one of the last vessels in the sealing fleet, still operating without ship-to-ship communication.
This is the detail that appears administrative. It will not stay administrative. In command of the Newfoundland was Captain Westbury Kean, 33 years old, known to the fleet as Wes. He had come up through sealing the way most of these men had, from a family already inside the industry, because his father was Abraham Kean. Abraham Kean commanded the SS Stefano, a larger and more modern vessel operating in the same ice fields that spring. He was 59 years old in 1914. He had captained sealing ships for over 3 decades. In the industry, he was not merely respected, he was the standard. His kill tallies were cited at the wharves the way batting averages are cited in dugouts. The ship owners trusted him completely. The government of Newfoundland trusted him. He had been decorated. He had been celebrated.
He was also a man who had never once, in 30 years of sealing, allowed weather to interrupt a harvest he believed was achievable.
The 2 ships departed St. John's in early March, part of a larger fleet moving northeast toward the ice. The harbor was busy. The departure was unremarkable. Dockhands worked the lines. Families stood on the wharves, as they always did. If you were the harbor master who watched them sail that morning, knowing what the ice could do, knowing those men had no radio, no shelter gear, no way to call for help? Would you have tried to stop them? Let me know in the comments. By the last week of March, the Newfoundland and the Stefano were working in proximity. The ice that year was heavy but active. The harp seals were there, and Abraham Kean had found a patch. On the morning of March 30th, Abraham Kean made a decision that was, by the customs of the fleet, entirely normal. He would transfer the men of the Newfoundland onto the ice to work his seal patch. His own ship's crew would work alongside them. Once the killing was done, the Newfoundland's crew would walk back to their own vessel. The logic was efficient. The seal patch was there. The men were available. The ice that morning was stable. What Abraham Kean did not do, what neither he nor Wes Kean did, was confirm in writing or by wireless who was responsible for retrieving the Newfoundland's men when the work was finished. There was no written order, no logged instruction, no wireless message from the Stefano to the Newfoundland or from the Newfoundland to the Stefano recording the arrangement.
The Stefano's wireless log for March 30th, 1914, records outgoing traffic related to ice conditions and seal sightings. It records no message to the SS Newfoundland regarding crew transfer arrangements or retrieval protocol.
This was not unusual. In 30 years of sealing, Abraham Kean had operated on understood custom. Captains communicated through proximity, through flag signals, through the informal language of men who had worked the same ice for decades. A formal written order would have seemed, to Kean, like an insult to the system that had worked for 30 years. The system had worked for 30 years because the weather had cooperated enough, and because the disasters that had occurred had been survivable enough, and because the industry had no formal mechanism for counting what it lost. By midday on March 30th, 132 men from the Newfoundland were on the ice. Abraham Kean fed them aboard the Stefano a meal, warm food, a brief stop. Then he pointed them toward the seal patch, and the Stefano moved off. Wes Kean's vessel sat in the ice some miles distant, her captain expecting his men to return before dark. The last man off the Stefano's gangway that afternoon was a sealer named Arthur Mouland. He was 26 years old, from Bonavista. He would survive. He would testify. And the specific detail he would give the inquiry, about which direction the Stefano steamed after dropping them, would become one of the 3 unresolved contradictions at the center of what came next.
Within 4 hours of Mouland stepping onto that ice, the sky to the northwest had changed into something the older sealers recognized and did not speak about calmly.
The men walked toward the seals. The Stefano's smoke disappeared into the gray. No one on either ship had confirmed the plan in writing. No one had checked the barometer twice. The storm arrived the way the worst storms always do on the North Atlantic ice. Not suddenly. Gradually. And then all at once. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon on March 30th, the wind had shifted northwest. The temperature was dropping. The older sealers among the Newfoundland's crew noticed it first, not with instruments, but with the specific instinct of men who had read ice weather since childhood. The sky to the northwest had gone the particular shade of white that means something different from clouds. Something harder. Some of the men turned back toward the Newfoundland before the order came. Some kept working. The seal patch was there. The pelts were money. The habit of the hunt was stronger, for a few minutes, than the weather. Then the snow came in. What followed was not a blizzard in the romantic sense, not the kind of storm that announces itself with drama. It was a whiteout, flat, total, directionless. Within 40 minutes of the first squall, the horizon had disappeared. The ice beneath their feet was indistinguishable from the sky above it. Men who had worked 50 yards apart could no longer find each other by sight. They called out. The wind took the sound.
The inquiry transcript records testimony from sealer Jesse Collins, who stated that by approximately 4:15 p.m. on March 30th, visibility had dropped to under 10 feet in the area where the Newfoundland's crew was working the floe. Wind speeds were estimated later at between 60 and 70 miles per hour.
The Newfoundland's crew had no tents. no emergency shelters, no signal flares issued per man. What they had was their oilskins, their gaffs, and each other. They formed into groups by instinct, the way men do when visibility collapses and the individual becomes suddenly inadequate. Moulin's group, Colin's group, several smaller clusters. They pressed together on the ice and they waited for the storm to break, because that is what you do on the floe when the storm comes in. You wait. And in the spring, on the North Atlantic, storms break. This one did not break. Not that night. By 7 p.m., the temperature had fallen to somewhere near minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The men had been on the ice for 6 hours. Some had eaten nothing since the brief meal aboard the Stefano. The ones in wet oilskins, those who had been near open water, were now at the edge of what the body can sustain. The ones who lay down to rest were pulled upright by the men next to them. To lie still, in those temperatures, in that wind, was understood without being stated. Aboard the Newfoundland, Wes Kean waited. The Stefano, several miles distant, had her wireless active. She sent and received traffic throughout the night, ice reports, position updates, routine fleet communications. At no point during the night of March 30th did the Stefano's wireless log record any transmission inquiring about the whereabouts or condition of the Newfoundland's crew on the ice.
132 men were somewhere on that floe, and the two ships that knew they were there each assumed the other had them.
Before we go deeper into what those men endured through the night, one quick thing. If this story has you, hit subscribe. New expedition every Thursday. And drop a comment below. What would you have done aboard the Stefano that night if you had been the wireless operator watching that log stay silent? I want to read your answers. Back to the ice. It is now the early hours of March 31st, and the temperature has not risen. 15 men were already dead or dying by dawn. The precise number who did not survive the night is still debated. The inquiry could not establish exact times of death from testimony alone. What is documented is the shape of what the survivors found when the light came back. Men frozen in seated positions, arms locked around their knees. Men who had used their last coherent energy to build small snow walls against the wind and had not survived long enough to benefit from them. The survivors kept moving. Moulin's group had walked through portions of the night, not with direction, but with motion, because motion was the only tool they had left. Some of the younger men could no longer feel their feet. Some had stopped speaking. The ice in daylight was flat and white and gave no information about where the ships were.
Sealer Cecil Mouland later testified that by the morning of March 31st, he could identify at least 9 men in his immediate group who were no longer capable of walking unaided. His estimate of total men still mobile within his sight was between 30 and 40.
Aboard the Newfoundland, Wes Kean had spent the night in the assumption his crew had been taken aboard the Stefano when the storm came in. It was what any captain would have done. It was what the custom of the fleet dictated. It was, in every way that the industry had constructed its logic, the reasonable assumption. The Stefano had made the same calculation in reverse. Neither ship had a mechanism. No wireless link, no formal protocol, no standing order that required confirmation before that assumption hardened into inaction. It was a sealer named George Tuff who finally forced the question into the open. Tuff was the Newfoundland's master watch, the man Wes Kean had sent with the crew onto the ice the previous morning. By mid-morning on March 31st, Tuff had gathered as many men as he could find and was moving them south, toward where he believed the Stefano was last positioned. His logic was simple and desperate. The Stefano had a wireless. The Stefano had food. The Stefano had to be told what was on the ice behind her. The walk took hours. Men dropped out of the column and were carried by the ones behind them. Some could not be carried. Tuff kept moving. At approximately 11:40 in the morning, the Stefano's lookout sighted a group of men on the ice. The ship altered course. The Stefano's log records the first survivors came aboard at roughly noon on March 31st, more than 18 hours after the storm had closed in on the floe.
when Tuff reached Abraham Kean and told him there were still men on the ice, men who had not moved all night, men who were frozen where they sat. Kean's recorded response, as entered in the Stefano's official log, was 4 words. He ordered the ship ahead.
This is the moment the inquiry would return to, again and again without resolving. What Abraham Kean ordered, specifically, was for the Stefano to move toward the seal patch, not toward the men still on the ice. His position, stated later under oath, was that the survivors who had reached his ship were safe, that the storm had broken sufficiently for the remaining men to reach either vessel on their own, and that the hunt was still viable. His position was that the loss of the work patch would cost the men their wages for the voyage. The Stefano moved off.
The Stefano's wireless log for March 31st records a transmission to the Newfoundland at 12:22 p.m., notifying Captain Wes Kean that survivors were aboard and that men remained on the ice. It does not record the number of men still unaccounted for. It does not record a position for those men.
Wes Kean received the message. He brought the Newfoundland through the ice toward the last known area of the floe. What his crew found across the next several hours would become the defining testimony of the inquiry, not because it was detailed, but because even the men who had survived it could not fully describe it without stopping. The final confirmed death toll was 78 men, 78 sealers from the northeast coast of Newfoundland, lost on the ice between 2 ships that both knew they were there. The youngest was a teenager from Greenspond. Several of the dead were found in groups of 3 and 4, arms locked, as if the last act had been to hold someone rather than to move. The Newfoundland returned to St. John's on April 2nd. The Stefano returned separately. The news reached the outport communities in the particular way that bad news travels in small places, person to person, door to door, before the newspapers had it.
One survivor, asked by a journalist what he would tell his family when he got home, said only, "I don't know yet what I saw. I think I need more time before I can say it."
The inquiry opened within weeks, and what it found, and what it stopped short of finding, is where this story becomes something harder than a disaster.
Because every contradiction in the official record points in the same direction, and the inquiry had the power to follow it, and it did not.
The inquiry into the loss of 78 men opened in St. John's in April of 1914. It had subpoena power. It had access to both ships, logs. It had the testimony of survivors who had been on the ice for nearly 20 hours, in temperatures below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. What it produced was a finding that satisfied almost no one who had read the full transcript. Begin with what the physical record shows. When the Newfoundland's crew recovered the dead from the ice on March 31st and the morning of April 1st, the positions of the bodies contained information. Men found in groups, arms interlocked, had not simply frozen together by accident. The posture, knees drawn up, bodies oriented away from the prevailing northwest wind, indicated these men had been alive long enough to make deliberate decisions about how to die with less suffering. They had built human windbreaks. Some had removed outer clothing and wrapped it around the men next to them. The physical evidence documents not panic but a prolonged, organized attempt to survive. That attempt lasted hours. The official inquiry finding states that death for most victims occurred in the early morning hours of March 31st, after midnight, before dawn. But the body positions and the testimony of survivors who had remained mobile through the same night do not cleanly support that window. Several survivors reported hearing voices from stationary groups as late as first light. If those voices were real, some of the men documented as having died in the early hours were alive well into the morning of March 31st, alive while the Stefano sat a few miles distant with her wireless operational.
The inquiry transcript records testimony from sealer Elias Pierroway, who stated under oath that he heard a man call out from a frozen group at approximately 7 in the morning on March 31st. The inquiry's final report does not reference Pierroway's testimony in its conclusions on time of death.
This is the first contradiction. The inquiry heard evidence that some men were alive after dawn. Its conclusions do not engage with that evidence. The second contradiction sits in the wireless logs. The Stefano was equipped with ship-to-ship wireless. She was transmitting and receiving throughout the night of March 30th and into March 31st. The Newfoundland had no wireless. This asymmetry was known before the expedition left St. John's. It was known to the ship owners. It was known to Abraham Kean. The absence of wireless on the Newfoundland was not an oversight. It was a cost. Wooden-hulled older vessels in the fleet had not been upgraded because the upgrade cost money, and the men aboard them did not own shares. The Stefano's wireless log for the night of March 30th records traffic with at least 3 other vessels in the fleet. Ice reports, seal sightings, position estimates. Not one transmission during those hours asks whether the Newfoundland's crew, transferred to the ice that morning by Abraham Kean's direct order, had returned safely to their ship. The inquiry's finding characterizes this as a failure of established custom rather than a failure of specific duty. But the wireless log makes the custom argument difficult. Kean had the means to inquire. Other captains were transmitting through the night. The silence on that specific subject was not the silence of a man without tools. It was the silence of a man who did not ask. Which of these contradictions is the one that stays with you? The suppressed testimony on time of death, or the wireless log that asked everything except the one question that mattered? Drop it in the comments before we get to Act 4. I want to see which one you clock. The third contradiction is structural, and it is the one the inquiry came closest to naming before it turned away. Abraham Kean testified that when George Tuff reached the Stefano at approximately noon on March 31st and informed him that men were still on the ice, he believed the storm had broken sufficiently for those men to self-rescue. He testified that his decision to move the Stefano toward the seal patch, rather than toward the remaining men, was consistent with his duty to the vessel's owners and to the financial interests of the crew. The inquiry accepted this framing, but Tuff's own testimony describes the condition of the men he had led to the Stefano. He described men who could not walk without support, men whose hands could no longer close, men who had been immobile on the ice since before midnight. Tuff told Kean what he had seen. The inquiry record contains both testimonies. They cannot both lead to the same conclusion about what a reasonable captain should have done at noon on March 31st.
The inquiry had Tuff's testimony and Kean's testimony in the same transcript. It had the body recovery reports. It had the wireless log. It found no individual criminally responsible. It issued no recommendation that would have changed the conditions that put those men on the ice, without shelter, without signals, without any vessel formally accountable for their return.
The finding named the disaster an accident of weather. The ship owners were not charged. The wireless gap was noted but not legislated against until a separate inquest later that same year. Abraham Kean continued to command sealing vessels. He would, in subsequent seasons, set records for annual seal harvests that stood for decades. The industry that had built the conditions for 78 deaths continued operating on the same economic architecture that had made those deaths possible. The families of the dead received no formal compensation. Several outport communities on the northeast coast lost enough working men in a single night that their economies did not recover within a generation. The names of the dead were recorded. The causes were recorded. The accountability was not. 3 theories have been advanced in the decades since the inquiry closed. They are not equally supported by the record, but each one illuminates something the official finding chose not to. The first and most thoroughly documented is the theory of cascading misjudgment. Not malice, but a system of assumptions so deeply embedded that no single man ever had to consciously choose to put those men at risk. Under this reading, Abraham Kean did not decide to abandon 78 men. He operated, as he always had, within a framework that distributed responsibility so broadly it effectively eliminated it. The custom of the fleet held that a captain was responsible for his own crew. The transfer of the Newfoundland's men onto the ice was done by Kean's invitation, but under Wes Kean's standing authority. The retrieval was implied, not specified. No written order had ever been required because the system had absorbed its previous failures quietly. Lost men counted as weather deaths, not accountability failures. Under this theory, The disaster was not an act. It was the final expression of a structure that had been building pressure for 30 years, and the men on that ice were simply the point at which it gave way. This theory has the most support in the record. It is also, in some ways, the least satisfying, because it leads nowhere that can be prosecuted, nowhere that can be sentenced, nowhere a community in grief can point and say, there. The second theory focuses specifically on the wireless silence. One line of historical investigation suggests that Abraham Kean's decision not to transmit any inquiry about the Newfoundland's crew during the night of March 30th was not indifference but strategy. Under this reading, Kean understood, not consciously, perhaps, but functionally, that asking the question would create the record. A wireless log entry reading, have Newfoundland's men return to their vessel, would have constituted documented knowledge of a potential emergency. The absence of that question preserved the possibility, later, of claiming that no emergency had been imagined. Historians working from the inquiry transcript have noted that Kean's testimony is remarkably precise about timeline and position on every subject except the 1-hour window in which a single transmission might have changed the outcome. The precision elsewhere makes the gap more visible, not less. This theory cannot be proven from existing records. It requires an inference about intent that the evidence supports but does not compel. What it does compel is the observation that a man who had operated wireless-equipped vessels for years and communicated throughout that same night with multiple ships in the fleet possessed, at minimum, the habit of transmission. He used that habit selectively. The inquiry did not ask him why.
The third theory is the one that historians with access to the full inquiry transcript have raised and then, without exception, stopped short of publishing in full, because it rests on a reading of the record that the families of the dead have never officially pursued, and because naming it plainly would require saying something the industry, the inquiry, and the government of Newfoundland in 1914 were each, for different reasons, unwilling to say.
The most structural reading of the evidence proposes that Abraham Kean, upon receiving George Tuff's report at noon on March 31st, had sufficient information to understand that men were dying on that ice. Not that men might be cold, not that men were uncomfortable, but that men who had been immobile since before midnight in -40-degree temperatures were, at that moment, in the final stages of cold exposure. Tuff's testimony, as recorded in the inquiry transcript, is not ambiguous about what he described. The condition of the men he led to the Stefano provided a direct index of the condition of the men he had left behind. Kean's decision to move toward the seal patch rather than toward the ice was, under this reading, not a misjudgment. It was a calculation. The pelts had a known value. The rescue had a cost: time, fuel. The disruption of a harvest that was Kean's primary metric of professional success. The inquiry had the testimony to construct this argument. It chose the weather. Which of these three theories sits closest to what the record actually supports? I read every comment. Tell me below before we get to the final chapter. What connects all three theories is not the man. It is the architecture around him. Abraham Kean did not invent the system that sent 132 men onto open ice, without shelter, without signals, without any formal protocol assigning responsibility for their return. He inherited it. He benefited from it. He operated within it, until the night it killed 78 people. And then the inquiry protected it, because the system that put those men on the ice was the same system that funded the inquiry, crewed the vessels, employed the captains, and exported salt cod and sealskins to markets that asked no questions about the conditions of their production. The disaster did not end the spring seal hunt. It did not fundamentally restructure the economics that had made those men's lives worth less than a season's pelt count. What it produced, eventually, was a wireless requirement. A rule that a ship must ask the question it already had the equipment to ask. 78 men. For a wireless regulation. The 78 men recovered from the ice were brought back to St. John's aboard the Newfoundland and laid out for identification. The process took days. Some could only be identified by the contents of their pockets: a pipe, a name sewn into a collar, a piece of paper folded into an oilskin breast pocket with an address on it. The youngest confirmed dead was 17 years old. Several families buried more than one man. The outport communities that lost the most, Doting Cove, Greenspond, Change Islands, received no structured government assistance. Charitable collections were organized in St. John's. Some money reached the widows. Most of it did not reach the amounts promised. By the following spring, the boats had gone north again. Abraham Kean was acquitted of all charges at the inquiry. He continued to command sealing vessels. In 1934, 20 years after the disaster, the government of Newfoundland awarded him a gold watch in recognition of having personally overseen the harvest of 1 million seals across his career. He accepted it. He died in 1945 at the age of 90. The families of the dead received no equivalent recognition.
A letter found in the jacket of sealer John Mulland, no relation to Cecil, was addressed to his wife in Bonavista. It had been written the night before the crew transferred to the ice. The last line read, "Tell the boy I will bring something back from the ice this time."
The Newfoundland disaster eventually found its historian. Cassie Brown, a Newfoundland journalist, spent years gathering survivor testimony before that generation was gone. Her 1972 book, Death on the Ice, is the primary public record of what those men experienced. It remained in print for decades. It is still the closest thing to a monument those 78 men have. Which of the three theories do you think is closest to the truth? I read every comment. In the Maritime History Archive at Memorial University of Newfoundland in St. John's, there is a collection box from the 1914 disaster inquiry. Inside it, among the documents, is a folded piece of paper, a duty roster from the Newfoundland listing the names of the men transferred to the ice on the morning of March 30th. Each name is written in pencil. Beside most of them, someone has made a small mark. The archive notes do not explain what the mark means. It has been there for over a century. It has not been explained. 110 years later, the inquiry is formally closed. The question of what Abraham Kean understood at noon on March 31st is not. Before the next expedition, one quick thing. Hit subscribe now. This channel is new. Every subscriber tells the algorithm these stories are worth keeping alive. Without that signal, they disappear. Turn on the bell. New expedition every Thursday. No exceptions, no gaps. Drop your theory in the comments. Cascading misjudgment, strategic silence, or deliberate calculation? 3 options. I read every one, and I will reply. If this one stayed with you, 78 men, 2 ships, 1 wireless that never asked. Leave a like. That is the only way the algorithm knows this mattered. On Thursday, the Carluk Stephenson's ship trapped and drifting through the Beaufort Sea, 25 men on the ice. The captain who walked away alone into the whiteout and was never ordered back. Some ships sink, some captains